today we're going to be looking at the ammunition and more specifically the shell types and what they can and can't do. This is something that is very looked over within the community, I feel, a lot of the time. So this video is going to set it straight, what the shells can and can't do, when you should use them, and when you should not use them. To start things off, these are all the shells in the game. You have AP, APCR, Heat, HE, and HESH. Now technically HESH is the same as HE, it just usually has higher pen than standard HE rounds. Now one thing I want to get clear straight away, there is no difference if the round is a premium round or a standard round to the shell characteristics, apart from when APCR is within the standard round. Both AP and APCR will lose pen over distance, but APCR will drop off the pen a lot more substantially than AP would, unless the APCR round is within the first standard shell slot. Then it will drop off exactly the same as an AP round would. So when you have something like a Leo 1 and you have APCR as its standard rounds and its premium rounds, the standard round will actually lose less pen over distance compared to what the premium round would. However, not every single round is equal within water tanks, and for example, the Leo will only lose 9 pen over distance for its standard rounds, but then only lose 8 pen for its premium rounds. But that's kind of an exception to the rule. If you take a look at the Chieftain, for example, the standard rounds will only lose 25 pen over distance, whereas the premium rounds will lose 40 pen over distance if you reach 500 meters. And then you have tanks like the GSOR 1008, which lose only 15 pen over distance for its standard rounds. And then if it uses its premium rounds, it will lose 101 over distance. So yes, there are exceptions to this rule, but the APCR round will lose the most over distance, apart from if it's in the standard slot. Which then brings me on to the rest of the shells and what they lose over distance. AP will lose a very minimal amount over distance, APCR losing quite a bit, as you can tell, but Heat and HE will lose 0 shell penetration over any range. There is no shell drop off in the pen. Even at 500 meters, if you're using 330 Heat, it will be 330 pen by the time that it gets to the target. Whereas as with the GSOR, you could have lost 101 pen in that time. Okay, so now to explain what can and can't go through walls. To do this, we're in the 121B. As you can see, there is a mouse behind a brick wall. As you can see, APCR as well as AP rounds will go straight through this and into the mouse. However, if we were to use Heat rounds, and we tried to go through the mouse here, it would just destroy the wall. Heat cannot pass through objects. Now for HE on the other hand though, this will pass through an object, however it needs enough pen to then go through it, and it will lose pen as it hits the object. So APCR will go through objects and will pen. Heat will explode on impact on an object such as a wall. And HE will go through it, but it needs enough pen once it reaches there. Now there are a few weird objects that Heat can pass through because it doesn't recognize it, such as this type of fence. If I fire Heat, and it will just go straight through, ignoring the fence, even though that there is something here. Even with this little wooden bit here, it will still just go through because it doesn't count this as an actual object. Similarly, APCR cannot just pass through absolutely everything. If you go and look at this, for example, this is a destructible building, and if I use APCR to try and go through it, it's just going to hit the building and then explode, and it won't count anything past that. Notice how this didn't even get destroyed after I shot it, whereas right now I could shoot through this little bit of wooden piles here, this wall, and hit the mouse. If you look here, it'll go through everything. Now, it's time to speak about Heat and Spaced Armour, because it's a little bit weird. If the Spaced Armour is strong enough, it will absorb the Heat round. However, on stuff like the S-Conk, you can just go straight through the Spaced Armour protection. This doesn't really care about the Spaced Armour, like with Heat rounds. Also, even the tracks, you can just pen it with Heat. However, when it becomes at an angle where you can no longer pen it, that is when the Spaced Armour is the most effective. Because as you can see, we're now at an angle, this is no longer pennable. Well, yeah, sure, we can go pen above the tracks, but No longer can we pen this, but as you go around, it becomes more and more pennable. So you need to be very, very careful because tracks will act as protection from heat rounds in the exact same way that a lot of people don't understand how to track people with heat. Because a lot of people will just do this and then say that heat is useless and it will never track someone. When realistically, you're never going to pen someone at this angle because of the Spaced Armour. The way that you want to track someone with heat is actually get to the side here, and then you can just go through like this, and then you can do tracking and damage. Now, the reason why you want to go for kind of this left-hand side and not right here, because look at the pen difference. So this goes from being 340-ish to them being 370. And obviously, at more of an angle, this goes down. So you're now only at 320. This is nice and easy pen for heat rounds. Anything with around about this, you'll be fine. Obviously, with AP and APCR, you can pen this relatively easily, especially just straight through this. But if you are in a pinch and you only have heat loaded, you can track them. It's just not at such an extreme angle. Now for something where the Spaced Armour actually makes a pretty big difference. This is the Kampfpanzer 07PE. Now this, as you can see, is not really pennable. Even with AP and APCR, it just doesn't matter. You have 285mm thick here at the very top where it kind of slopes off, and then you would need to go through it. But if I was to use heat, this goes all the way up to 381mm effective. And if I don't use 350 heat like the 121B has, and I use something, say, with 320 heat, that is not going to pen. Even if I went all the way up close and was basically face-hugging this guy, it would still be 350 pen to go through the shovel on this tank. And just to show you that it is actually the shovel that is doing this, if you look to the side here, that's an easy pen at only 260mm thick. And that is even slightly sloped off at an angle. So the Spaced Armour does make a very meaningful impact if it is strong enough. The S-Conk's Spaced Armour on the side is mostly only for HE, because it won't have enough impact once it goes through. Which is why a lot of people get confused on the S-Conk when they get penned by heat and it goes straight through the little kind of Spaced Armour bit. It's not really thick enough to do anything. Whereas when you get something like this is more than good enough to deal with pretty much anything you do. Now when it comes to AP against Spaced Armour, it doesn't really care. This is the Hori 3 against the Spaced Armour that we just showed. As you can see, we only need about 360mm of pen. And fair enough, we are slightly above it because we are slightly taller than what we were in the 121B. But as you can see, even if we go down, it's only going to need about 280. And if we to use the 360 APCR, or AP, sorry, the entire thing is just green. Like, it is mental how much stuff you can just pen with the Hori 3. And as you can see, really doesn't matter. Next up, we're going to speak about shell normalization. Normalization means that when the shell hits a target, it will normalize the impact angle to better go through the target's armor. Therefore, meaning that it needs less pen to actually pen the target. So say, for example, you're hitting something that is at a very, very steep angle or a steep slope. It will then normalize the impact angle a little bit so that it is less of a strong impact angle. Heat and HE as well as HESH do not have any normalization on their shells. What they hit, they will have to try and go through. That is not too bad, considering that most of the time heat and HE have their pen not lose anything over distance, and also heat especially will have enough pen to just brute force its way through. AP has 5 degrees of normalization and APCR has 2 degrees of normalization. This is why people like the Hori 3 so much, because even the standard rounds at 305 pen, because that is an AP round, you have so much extra pen when you're shooting at something. I think the best way that I can show you this is by just looking at a 279, for example, and this is what it sees against 320 heat rounds. As you can see, yes, you can pen it semi-reliably as long as you are shooting directly what you're looking at. This is the Hori 3 with 305 less pen than the 320 heat round, but because it has 5 degrees of normalization, it doesn't care. This is the standard round, and it will just go straight through whatever it is looking at. Even at more, like, greater angles like this, that is more of what we were looking at with the heat round. But this is now way, way more of a steeper angle. If it's on flat ground, and you're facing a Hori 3 and you're 279, don't peek it. And just for a laugh, here's what it looks like against 360 AP. And just to show you the difference between AP and APCR, this is what the Błyskawiczka looks like, the new tier 10 Polish tank destroyer with 292mm pen, and then if you use 321, you can see it's still, that's basically just as good as the standard rounds of the Hori with 305. So APCR and AP are super nice when you do come up against people that do have steeper angles, but AP is the best, unless you have a lot of pen with your heat. Next up is Ricochet Angles, and this is pretty simple. This is the angle at which the shell will no longer be able to pen. AP and APCR both have a 70-degree ricochet angle, which means that anything greater than 70 degrees is an auto ricochet. Heat has an 85-degree ricochet angle, which means that it is technically a little bit better, but then at the same time, if you're at that such a steep angle, you're going to have a very, very hard time at penning it, because it doesn't have normalization. Now, HE and HESH actually cannot ricochet. They have a 0-degree ricochet angle, meaning that if you hit something, it's going to explode on impact, and then just, that's it. The shell is dissipated. Also, because HE does explode on impact, if you don't hit anything and you don't pen, it will then just do a spalling effect and try and burrow its way down into wherever it can. Now, this is why you sometimes get set on fire when it does like 30 damage, or you get your crew member knocked out with only 30 damage done. It's because it's hit somewhere, it's found its way in, and then it's done its spalling effect. That is why those things happen. That is also why, if you're trying to do the crit missions for the 279 and 260 and whatever else, it's best to actually choose something that isn't going to pen, but does enough damage, such as like a larger caliber, like a Badger, and just load HE and just keep shooting someone, because you're probably going to knock out crew members. Now, to really show you how ricochet angles work, we've gone into game. This is the STRV 1030. Remember, AP and APCR have a 70-degree ricochet angle. Heat has an 85-degree ricochet angle. This means I will never be able to pen the STRV 1030 because of the angle it is at. At the moment, it is about 79 to 80 degrees for the ricochet angle. But if I use heat, I can pen it. So this can be super, super useful to know and understand why you can pen with heat and not APCR, because it is the ricochet angles. Now, the last thing that I'm going to speak about is overmatching. This is where if your caliber of your gun is greater than 3 times the thickness of the armor that you're shooting at, it will automatically pen if you're using AP or APCR. To give you an example, this is the STRV 1030 against the 121B. The 121B has a 105mm gun. The 1030 has a 40mm plate, meaning that you are going to need a greater than 120mm caliber gun to overmatch this tank. Even if you had something like the Chieftain, which has a 120 caliber gun, as you can see, it still cannot pen this. It needs to be greater than 120. That could mean 120.000001, and you would easily overmatch this thing. But if it's not greater than 120, you are not penning it. If you were to choose a 113, it would overmatch it. Notice how this is now in a blue color. That means it is an overmatch, because the 113 has a 122mm caliber gun. So to fully recap all the shells, AP and APCR are probably the best shells in the game that you would want to be firing. They can overmatch their target, they have normalization benefits, and they don't really care about objects. For the vast majority of times, if you were to give both AP and APCR equal pen to heat rounds, and you were both firing at a target, the AP round would just be flat out better. The only time that heat rounds are really, really nice is at the extreme angles where you go past that 70 degrees and you need heat to be able to pen it, unless you can overmatch. And of course, HE can go through objects, but it will lose pen as it goes through, and saying that, because it does have the least pen of them all, by the time that it goes through the object, you might not pen what you're trying to hit. Now, there is one thing that I want to add into HE, because HE will actually track people pretty much every single time as long as you have enough alpha. If you go for the track wheel and you shoot HE, you will track them in one shot, even if they are using hardening. This can be super useful if you're trying to reset a cap, for example, and you just want to quickly just reset it. You don't care about doing damage to that person, but you need it just to be reset. Just put a HE round into someone's track and it will reset the cap. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you learned something. Let me know in the comments down below. I'll see you all in the next video.